Recognizing our MLA from Chilliwack North.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Let's stop dressing this bill up in the language of modernization. Let's stop pretending this is a technical cleanup, an administrative tune-up, or a harmless rewrite of procedure. It's not. Bill 9 is a political decision to give government more control over what the public can learn, when the public can learn it, and whether the public can learn it at all. The official explanation notes alone tell the story. They say the bill changes the duty to respond without delay to a duty to respond without unreasonable delay. Lets the head of a public body decide whether a request contains enough detail, excludes certain records tied to court proceedings, creates a new refusal power for communications by or for judicial officers on policy or legislation, expands the grounds for disregarding requests, and permits longer review times. This is not a package of reforms aimed at openness. It is a package of reforms aimed at discretion, delay, and denial. Freedom of information exists for one reason: because the public has a right to know what the government is doing in its name and with its money. It exists because the public records are not the private property of ministers, deputy ministers, chief of staffs, political operatives, or communication directors. It exists because democratic accountability is impossible when the government controls the flow of information about itself. That principle was baked into British Columbia's original FOI law. Rob Botterall, who was a part of that, my colleague from the Green, oops.
We do not use names of any of our members here,
Got
please.
it. MLA, I don't know what riding he's from. Anyways, my colleague, who says he led the team that developed BC's FOI legislation for the Harcourt government, is that wrong too? Oh, that was okay, wrote that the act was passed unanimously in 1992 and was once hailed as the best in North America. He also warns that the system has been chipped away piece by piece and that Bill 9 risks turning freedom of information into freedom from information. That phrase matters, freedom from information. It captures exactly what this bill does, not in one dramatic stroke, not with one flashy clause that every British Columbian will notice overnight. A word changed here, a threshold moved there, a little more power handed to the institution being scrutinized. A little less power left to the person asking the question, a little more patience demanded of the citizen, a little more latitude granted to the state, and each of these changes can be defended by a minister. Each can be described as practical. Each can be called balanced, but taken together, they amount to a plain and unmistakable message from this government. We want more control over access, and we want less accountability when we deny it. Look at the time limit change under Bill 9, Section 6(1) is amended by striking out without delay and substituting without unreasonable delay. That is not semantics, that is substance. Without delay is a clear command. Without unreasonable delay is a debate. It invites argument. It opens the door to excuses. It lets the public body say, well, in our view, this took a reasonable amount of time. A standard that once pointed government towards urgency is replaced with wording that can be stretched, defended, rationalized, and lawyered into meaning almost anything. This government knows exactly why they change one word in legislation. One word can shift the entire culture of compliance. One word can move an obligation from firm to fuzzy. One word can take a citizen's right and turn it into an opinion. And that is before we get to Section 5. Bill 9 repeals the current wording and substitutes a new requirement that a request in the opinion of the head of the public body provide enough detail to let an experienced employee identify the record with reasonable effort and in a reasonable amount of time. In other words, the bill does not merely require an applicant to describe what they want. It explicitly says that the sufficiency of the request is determined by the head of the body being asked for the records. The institution being scrutinized gets to decide whether the request is specific enough. The gatekeeper becomes the judge. The respondent becomes the arbiter. That is not a neutral process. That is a built-in conflict of interest embedded in the law itself. Ask yourself how that works in the real world. A journalist files a request about communications related to a procurement decision. An opposition MLA seeks documents related to briefing notes, internal warnings, or contract irregularities. A foster youth asks for records tied to their own history. A citizen seeks correspondence concerning a controversial service failure. Under Bill 9, the public body can say the request lacks enough detail, not because it is impossible to understand, but because, in the opinion of the head, it cannot be identified with reasonable effort and in a reasonable amount of time. Those are elastic phrases. These are subjective phrases. They are phrases that shift the burden from government to the applicant. And that is exactly the opposite of what a strong FOI is supposed to do. Then we arrive at section 43, and this is where the mask really slips.
Member, my apologies to interrupt you, recognizing the Minister of Indigenous Relations.
Thank you, and apologies. I seek leave to make an introduction.
Shall leave be granted? Aye. Minister.
Thank you very much. On behalf of the Minister of Energy and Climate Solutions, the member for Vancouver Renfrew, or Vancouver Trout Lake, or Vancouver Kingsway, I know it's had a couple of names or suggested names. Anyways, you're all here from St. Mary's, I believe. Thumbs up. Go St. Mary's. Your minister, your MLA, Minister Ricks, is not his name, but it sounds like Ricks. We don't say last names in this house. We refer to each other by ministry titles. So his Hadrian Ricks rhymes with your minister's name. Anyways, he wanted me to welcome you all to your chamber, to your house, the People's House. We are currently debating freedom of information and protection of personal privacy legislation. Thank you and welcome to your legislature.
Thank you, Minister. Indeed, welcome to everyone in the chamber. The minister quite rightly pointed out that we don't use names to define any one of our members, so we do refer to our ridings, recognizing the member from Chilliwack North to continue her debate.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Bill 9 adds and modifies the grounds on which the Commissioner can authorize a public body to disregard requests. The new language adds that the behavior of the applicant can be abusive or malicious. It allows a request to be disregarded if responding would unreasonably interfere with the operations of the public body or the government of British Columbia. It also allows a request to be characterized as an abuse of the right to make a request because it is repetitious or systematic, or because it is excessively broad. When we say those words out loud, abusive, malicious, unreasonable, interfere, repetitious, systematic, excessively broad, these terms are meant to shut down scrutiny that is inconvenient, persistent, or maybe embarrassing. Because who exactly files requests that are repetitive or systematic? Journalists do. Opposition researchers do. Watchdogs do. Citizens who suspect there is a pattern do. People investigating waste, misconduct, or incompetence do. A single document rarely exposes a serious problem. It takes persistence. It takes follow-up. It takes multiple requests. It takes systemized inquiry. And that is how public interest investigations work. So when a bill flags systematic or repetitious behavior is as a basis for disregarding requests, it is not striking at abuse in the abstract. It is creating a weapon that can be aimed at determined scrutiny in practice. And let us not ignore the unreasonable interference with operations language. Scrutiny is inconvenient, and that's too bad. Every department can say that locating records takes staff time. Every bureaucracy can say that answering questions interrupts business as usual. But that is the point of a Freedom of Information law. It is supposed to impose an obligation on the state to serve the public's right to know, even when it is inconvenient. If the test becomes whether disclosure work disrupts operations, then the very existence of accountability is recast as a nuisance. My colleague earlier said, when we were debating this session a few weeks ago, says plainly that under under the Premier's government, legislative oversight is increasingly seen as a nuisance and is being replaced by closed cabinet door decision-making. That criticism lands because Bill 9 reads like legislation drafted by a government that sees scrutiny as interference rather than democracy. Kirk LaPointe put it just as bluntly in an op-ed. In his commentary, he writes that Bill 9 is really Bill 9, N-E-I-N. He says that legislation is marketed as modernization, but is not. He calls it strategic legislation to defer, delay, and deny the public's right to know. He further writes that the original democratic premise of the law was that government records belong to the public unless there is a defensible reason to withhold them, and that the burden rested on the state, not the citizen. Those are devastating observations because they identify the philosophical shift underneath this bill. This government is moving away from a culture in which disclosure is the default and toward one in which the applicant must satisfy the system, navigate the hurdles, and accept the government's view of what is reasonable. And what happens when disclosure becomes slower and more discretionary and more applicant burdened? LaPointe answers that too. He warns that the changes make access slower, less predictable, and more discretionary. That is not the description of a stronger accountability regime. That is the description of a weaker one. Slower means information arrives too late to inform public debate. Less predictable means applicants cannot rely on a clear process. More discretionary means outcomes depend increasingly on internal judgments rather than firm statutory duties. Taken together, those effects do not just frustrate requesters, they chill scrutiny. They tell local media outlets, independent journalists, citizen advocates, and ordinary people that unless they have the time, money, and persistence to fight, the process may not be worth it. That chilling effect, that chilling effect matters. A Freedom of Information law is not healthy because it exists on paper. It is healthy because taxpayers, ordinary people, believe they can use it. If people conclude that requests will take too long, be denied for technical reasons, or be characterized as burdensome, they stop asking. And when they stop asking, government secrecy does not even need to work very hard. It wins by discouragement. It wins by exhaustion. It wins by turning accountability into a process only the most well-resourced can endure. That is why this chamber should not dismiss wording changes as administrative. Administrative barriers are one of the most effective ways to kill a right without formally abolishing it. Bill 9 also excludes from Part 2 of the Act certain records that must be produced, listed, or identified as part of a proceeding, including records that fall within a general class of records listed or identified as part of the proceeding. Again, the explanatory note says that right on page 1, and the text on page 2 spells it out. When government, the Attorney General, or the Government of British Columbia is required by law as part of a proceeding to produce, list, or identify records, those records are carved out from the access part of the Act in that context. This is not some obscure housekeeping adjustment. It narrows the route through which applicants can seek access and broadens the zone in which government can say, in effect, not here, not this way. Then there is a new section, 16.1, allowing the head of a public body to refuse to disclose information that would reveal the substance of a communication of a judicial officer or one made on behalf of a judicial officer respecting a proposed or existing policy, program, or enactment. That may sound specialized, but the effect is obvious. It creates another class of information that can be withheld. And what is the broad trend of this bill? More carve-outs, more refusal powers, more institutional control over the disclosure boundary. Government says this is refinement. The public sees, rightly, that it is another ratchet in one direction only. The bill also allows the head of a public body to extend the time for responding to a request by a period to which the applicant consents, and the Commissioner's inquiry timeline can now be extended beyond 90 days if the Commissioner specifies a later date and notifies the relevant persons. On paper, those may sound reasonable. In practice, they further normalize longer timelines. When the law already weakens the promptness standard from without delay to without unreasonable delay, and then adds more room for extensions and later dates, the combined message is unmistakable. Waiting is becoming part of the architecture. Government is not moving towards faster disclosure. It is building itself a more forgiving delay structure. And now we have to talk about the politics of this, because the politics are inseparable from the bill. The Canadian Taxpayers Federation said the government should immediately resume proactive disclosures and cancel Bill 9, describing the pause in proactive disclosures in the bill itself as part of a larger rollback. Its March 18th news release said the pause means government stopped routinely publishing things such as ministerial briefing notes, purchase card records, travel expenses for ministers and deputy ministers, and contracts awarded without a competitive process. The same release quotes Carson Binda saying that the Premier had launched an all-out offensive against transparency and accountability government, and adds that Bill 9 would make it easier for bureaucrats to delay and deny FOI requests. The Federation also listed examples of stories that came to light because of FOI requests. We've heard them in this House. Gift card bonuses for bureaucrats, a budget line for an open bar reception, ministers billing taxpayers for an Amsterdam happy hour, government spending on novelty soccer balls, expensive hotels in Dubai, and limousine service costs for a ministerial trip. The point is that the public learned about those things because access tools existed and were used. When a government that has been embarrassed by records then moves to weaken access, people are entitled to draw conclusions. They are entitled to think the government has learned the wrong lesson. Not, we should spend better, but we should hide better. This is why the phrase assault on government transparency resonates. It is not just about the text of Bill 9 in isolation. It's about the context in which the bill arrives. A government pause proactive disclosure of spending-related documents and, at the same time, advances a bill that makes ordinary access requests easier to delay, challenge, and disregard. British Columbians do not need a doctorate in public administration to see the pattern. Fewer routine disclosures, more discretion over requests, more ability to call scrutiny disruptive, more power to decide what is reasonable, less sunlight, more fog. And this is where the government's defense collapses. Says the bill is about efficiency. But efficiency for whom? If a ministry can decide requests lacks enough detail because, in its opinion, an experienced employee cannot find the records within a reasonable effort or a reasonable amount of time, that may be efficient for the ministry. It is not efficient for the public. If requests can be characterized as excessively broad or systematic and disregarded, that may be efficient for bureaucracy. It is not accountability for British Columbians. If response duties are softened and review timelines lengthened, that may be administratively convenient for government. It is not meaningful access for an applicant waiting for answers. Convenience is the institution, not the same as justice for the public. Another point that should be taken seriously: the legislation makes no distinction between general requests from journalists or legislators and requests by individuals seeking their own personal records, such as child and youth foster care records or employment records. That matters, because behind the legal jargon, it's not just politics, it's also a human reality. Delays in access are not always about headlines. Sometimes they are about people trying to understand what happened to them. People trying to reconstruct a life event, a care history, an employment issue, or an administrative decision that changed their future. When government loosens timelines and hardens the gate, it is not only the press gallery that pays, ordinary people do too. My colleague also recently said that it is magical thinking to suggest that making it easier to delay or deny access to general information will somehow speed up the process. That is exactly right. The government wants the public to believe that weakening requesters' rights is a pathway to a better functioning system. But if a system is overloaded, the answer is to improve record management, improve searchability, invest in staff capacity, and expand proactive publication. The answer is not to move the goalposts for applicants. The answer is not to grant more refusal powers. The answer is not to downgrade urgency in the statute itself. The answer is not to tell citizens that their rights are causing the inefficiency. Bill 9 goes in the opposite direction on core access questions. That is important politically as well as legally. It means this bill is not the inevitable product of expert consensus. It is a choice. The government chose this path. It chose a more discretion over more openness. It chose a softer duty to respond. It chose wider disregard powers. It chose to put more weight on administrative convenience than on the public's right to know. And because it is a choice, members opposite are responsible for it. They cannot hide behind their officials. They cannot hide behind drafting counsel. They cannot say this is simply a modernization file from a ministry. Every clause in this bill expresses a value judgment. Every clause answers a question. When there is tension between convenience for government and access for public, whose side are you on? Bill 9 answers the government side. When there is tension between institutional workload and democracy scrutiny, whose burden do you lighten? Bill 9 answers the institutions. When there is tension between certainty for the applicant and discretion for the state, whom do you trust? Bill 9 answers, the state. That is why in Lapointe's op-ed, the line about original premise of the law matters so much. He says the burden rested on the state, not on the citizen. Bill 9 shifts that burden. The applicant must be precise enough, narrow enough, acceptable enough, not too broad, not too systematic, not too repetitive, not too interfering, not too time-consuming. And who decides whether they've crossed the line? The very people whose records they want. That is not a robust right. That is a tolerated request process conditional on the patience of bureaucracy and the tolerance of government. Members opposite may say that the commissioner still plays a role. Of course the commissioner plays a role, but Bill 9 itself broadens the grounds upon which the commissioner can authorize a public body to disregard requests, and it permits later dates for inquiries beyond the default 90-day timeline in certain circumstances. Even oversight is being furnished with a looser calendar and a broader vocabulary of refusal. That is not strengthening of external control over secrecy. It is a recalibration that gives the system more room to accept delay and disregard it as ordinary. So what is really going on here? The answer is political culture. The most troubling aspect of Bill 9 is cultural. A cultural openness once promised in 1992 has been broken, and that system has been dismantled piece by piece. The CTF says government is trying to ensure embarrassing documents never see the light of day. Different voices, different politics, same theme. This bill reflects a government culture that sees transparency as a risk to be managed rather than a duty to be honored. Mr. Speaker, that is why this debate matters, far beyond lawyers, journalists, or FOI specialists, because if government can normalize the idea that rights are subject to administrative convenience, then the damage does not stop with access to records. It teaches a lesson about citizenship itself. It says your right to know is not a foundational democratic guarantee, but a request that the state may accommodate if it finds your wording tidy, your persistence modest, and your curiosity manageable. That is a corrosive lesson in democracy. The people of British Columbia deserve better than that. They deserve a government that meets requests with urgency, not excuses. A government that strengthens proactive disclosure instead of pausing it. A government that invests in record systems instead of blaming applicants for asking hard questions. A government that remembers why freedom of information laws exist in the first place. Not to protect the comfort of the executive, but to protect the sovereignty of the citizen. So let us stop pretending this is neutral. Let us stop pretending that no values are at stake. Let us stop pretending Bill 9 simply updates an old statute for a digital age. This bill changes who carries the burden. It changes who gets the benefit of ambiguity. I can't say it. It changes who controls the pace. It changes who can call scrutiny unreasonable. It changes who decides whether a request is acceptable, and in every one of those changes, the balance tilts the same way toward government and away from the public. That is why this House needs to reject the spin on Bill 9. Read the words in the opinion of the head of the public body. Read the words without unreasonable delay. Read the words abusive or malicious. Read the words repetitious or systematic. Excessive or broad, unreasonably interfere with operations. Those are not words of a government opening windows. Those are words of a government installing thicker curtains. Honourable Speaker, freedom of information is not a courtesy extended by the powerful to the powerless. It is not a favor. It is not a gift. It is not a democratic right rooted in a simple proposition in a free society that people must be able to know what their government is doing. Bill 9 weakens that right. It makes access less timely, less certain, and more dependent on the judgments of the institutions being scrutinized. It expands the state's ability to say no. It broadens the language available to defend, delay, and disregard. And it arrives in a climate where proactive disclosures have been paused, and critics from across the spectrum are warning that British Columbia is moving from freedom of information toward freedom from information. For all of those reasons, this bill is not modernization. It is retrenchment. It is not balance. It is bureaucratic self-protection. It is not transparency reform. It is a retreat from transparency, and it needs to be defeated. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.